In this video, I'm going to show you a simple sourdough starter recipe that's perfect for beginners with its easy to follow and straightforward steps. If you haven't yet, be sure to check out my previous video where I list all the essential tools needed for your sourdough journey. Sourdough starter is a combination of flour and water in equal parts mixed together to create a culture for the wild yeast and the bacteria in your environment. This is the original way bread was made, and the reason people are going back to sourdough is because it's healthier, it's richer in nutrients, less likely to spike your blood sugar, contains lower amounts of gluten, and is generally easier to digest than bread made with commercial yeast. The idea of making your own sourdough starter can be intimidating. While it's a relatively easy process, there are also many factors that can cause it to fail, from the type of liquid and flour used, room temperature, not to mention all the uncertainty introduced by the unpredictable world of wild yeast and bacteria that makes each starter unique. So I'm going to share some important tips and information throughout the course of this video. My goal is to help you to successfully develop your own sourdough starter on your first try. Let's get started. First, we need to choose a type of flour, which brings us to tip number 1. What type of flour is best for your sourdough starter? Higher protein flour, such as bread flour or whole wheat flour, will typically produce a more active and vigorous starter, giving you a better chance to succeed. When you're starting out, choose something with more than 12% protein. Whatever flour you choose, just make sure they are unbleached, because bleach ultimately flattens out bacterial cultures, and we need bacteria in order to make sourdough starter. On day 1, before you start, record the weight of the clean jar in grams. We will need to know how much starter to leave in the jar when we do the feeding, so knowing the weight of the jar will help us determine what's the total weight of the leftover starter. Set the weight back to 0. Add 10 grams of bread flour and 10 grams of whole wheat flour in there. I chose to use a 50-50 blend because it gave me the best result in my previous test. I did a separate video to put the 3 most common types of flour to test so you can see it. I'll provide the link in description below. Next, add 20 grams of water. Be sure to use filtered water. Tap water or water containing chlorine can kill the good bacteria in your starter. You can use spring water or drinking water, not distilled water. You want the water to be at room temperature, that means in between 75 to 82 degrees. Mix this up vigorously until the flour is thoroughly combined. There are natural yeast and bacteria floating in the air, so this vigorous mixing is actually going to help us pick some of those up as well. We'll be tending this the same way for the following days, so think about when would be the most convenient time of the day for you would be, and do this around the same time every day. The ideal room temperature for growing sourdough starter is 70 to 80 degrees. Lower temperature slows things down and higher temperatures speed this process up. But don't be tempted to leave this at a spot that is too hot. It will kill the wild yeast if exposed for long periods. I find the environment temperature is the trickiest part for beginners because there are lots of variables depending on where you live, especially as seasons change. If you are not sure, the best and safest practice is to leave your starter in the oven with the oven light on. If you do, be sure to put a note there so you won't accidentally preheat your oven while the starter is in there. Make it a habit to scrape down the side every time, so it will be easier for us to observe what happened inside the jar. Place a breathable cover over the top. You can use coffee filter or napkin and secure it with a rubber band, or just place a lid on top without tightening it. We want air to be able to escape from the jar. Leave it at room temperature until the same approximate time tomorrow. Since I will be using the 50-50 flour blend for the following days, I went ahead and pre-mixed some so the process will be easier. On day 2, this is a starter after 24 hours. Not much activity is happening yet, and this is normal. If you see some little bubbles already, that's normal too. To it, we're going to add 20 grams of flour again and 20 grams of water. You don't need a lot of flour and water to start with. I have seen people use 50 grams to start and some even 100 grams. There's nothing wrong in doing that, but it will just cost you more flour and then have a lot to discard later. I don't like a lot of discard, so I start with something small, but have enough to cling to the side of my jar. Stir until the flour is thoroughly combined. Scrape the side. From here onwards, put a rubber band around the jar to the level of the starter. This will help us keep track of the starter as it rises. Cover and leave it at room temperature for 24 hours. Day 3. Bubbles are now beginning to form. It has risen a bit in the last 24 hours. It also started to smell sour. These bubbles are the result of the CO2 gases that the microbes are releasing as they consume the properties of the flour as food. When looking down into the jar, you'll notice it has a gassy puffiness to it now, as well as a stretchiness as it clings to the side of the jar. We have successfully caught some wild yeast. The mixture has become full of life and air. While you think this looks good, this is not the correct balance of bacteria and yeast we want to make sourdough bread. This is commonly known as the false rice. It will take some time before the correct balance works out, as you will see over the course of this video. Today onwards, we'll begin our feeding regimen. Discard all but 20 grams of day 2 mixture. My jar weighs 274 grams, so it means I want to discard the starter until I have 294 grams left. This is why it's good to know how much your jar weighs before you start. Add 20 grams of whole wheat and bread flour mixture and 20 grams of water in there, and stir until the flour is thoroughly combined. What we are creating here is called 100% hydration starter. This means we have equal amounts of flour and water by weight. If you ever heard people talking about what hydration percentage their starter is, this is what it means. 100% hydration is the most common. Now we'll talk about tip number 2, why discard is necessary. Not sure if you ever wonder why we need to discard. It seems a little wasteful. I certainly thought so when I first watched Sourdough Starter video, but very soon I've learned that discard is really necessary, and this is why. First, discard keeps the starter volume under control. 2. Feeding a starter by discarding creates less waste than if no discard were done. In our case here, where I'm keeping 20 grams of starter and I have to feed 20 grams of flour and 20 grams of water into it. So now I have a total of 60 grams of mixture in the jar. If no discard is done with the next feeding, these 60 grams of starter will need a minimum of equal weight flour and water in order to have enough food. With 60 grams of starter, 16 grams of flour, and 60 grams of water, I will then have 180 grams of mixture. If this continues without discarding, I will have over 14,000 grams of starter on day 7. And the truth of the matter is, unless I run a bakery, I can never use up that much starter, so that it's even more wasteful. Not to mention, a regular good feeding protocol will also strengthen your starter, giving you a better bread. Therefore, while we are building it to that stage, discard is necessary. I do, however, have a way to maintain the starter with very minimum to no discard at all. I will show you how in a different video of how I maintain my sourdough starter. Scrape the side, cover, and leave at room temperature for 24 hours. Day 4. Again, it shows some evidence of gas production and rise a little bit. Just like yesterday, discard all but 20 grams of day 3 mixture. Add 20 grams of whole wheat and bread flour mixture and 20 grams of water in there, and stir until the flour is thoroughly combined. Once you have a mature starter, you can definitely use that discard for many great and delicious recipes. But while you're growing your starter, you just want to get rid of it. That means you should wait until it's reliably rising and falling each day with signs of fermentation. Then you can start storing the discard, because that signals that your starter has a stable mix of good bacteria and yeast. Tip number 3. Every starter is different. I watched many videos about sourdough starter before I started my own journey. What I found interesting is whatever you do, there's always someone else saying that it's wrong. So what I've learned is there's no single correct way, and every starter is unique to its own. Flours being sold in different countries or even just different brands may contain different level of protein and so on. So don't worry too much if you're not seeing the exact same action in your starter compared to others. It's simply because every starter is different. Scrape the side, cover, and leave it at room temperature for 24 hours. Day 5. Looks like it has risen and fallen in the last 24 hours. This is called the rise and fall. This is a good sign of the starter's healthy microbe activity. This is why you want to scrape the jar. When the side is clean, you'll be able to see the line where the highest point of rise before it goes back down. Final bubbles now indicate the starter has passed its peak. Since deteriorated gluten cannot hold big gas bubbles easily, if you get to day 5 and the growth seems to have slowed down, don't worry, just continue to feed it. It's starting to smell like regular yeast now. Discard all but 20 grams of day 4 mixture. Add 20 grams of whole wheat and bread flour mixture and 20 grams of water in there, and stir until the flour is thoroughly combined. I'm going to share with you tip number 4. An active starter is a predictable starter. As I mentioned earlier, every starter is different. So how do I know if I have successfully made my own starter? The good news is you don't have to guess. An active and healthy starter is a predictable starter. Through the daily feeding and maintenance, you will start to see that your starter has a pattern of rising and falling about the same time. It may not be the exact hour, but you will see that the pattern is predictable. This is a sign that you have successfully made your own active starter. Scrape the side, cover, and leave at room temperature for 24 hours. By day 6, we're seeing quite a bit of growth, lots of bubbling on top and throughout the mixture. Since it only took the starter about 5 hours to rise to its peak yesterday before it started to fall, from today onwards I'm going to switch the feeding ratio to 1 to 2 to 2. Discard all but 20 grams of day 5 mixture. Add 40 grams of whole wheat and bread flour mixture in there and 40 grams of water. This brings us to tip number 5, how to determine what ratio to feed. By now you know your starter is a living culture. There are lots of yeast and bacteria living in this jar and they need food. The food means fresh water and flour. The more of this culture that you keep, the more life there is within it, and therefore more food is needed. But how much food is the right amount of food? At a minimum, you really need to be feeding your starter at a 1 to 1 to 1 ratio, which means however much starter you keep in a jar, you need to feed it with equal amounts of flour and water by weight. In my sample starter here, I was feeding it at a 1 to 1 to 1 ratio and the starter rose to its peaks very quickly. It started to fall completely in just a matter of 12 hours. Then you will know that 1 to 1 to 1 is not enough, and you now have 2 options. You can either add more food, switch it to a 1 to 2 to 2 ratio, or keep the 1 to 1 to 1 but feed it twice a day. Feeding twice a day is harder to keep up, therefore increasing the ratio is often the more practical approach. Once you increase the ratio, see how it acts for 24 hours. If it still rises very rapidly, then you can increase it to 1 to 3 to 3. For example, these 2 samples came from the same main starter jar. I fed one with a 1 to 1 to 1 ratio and the other 1 to 3 to 3. See that the 1 to 1 to 1 sample rises more quickly than the other? The 1 to 3 to 3 sample has more food, therefore it will take it longer to go through all that. No matter what ratio you feed it, it will still rise and fall within 24 hours. That is a good and healthy sign, so don't feel like you want to feed it a lot to prevent falling. When the starter is young, we just want to keep it happy and active without having to starve. While you are starting out, it's a good practice to find the balance to keep your starter healthy. So I hope this concept will help you understand how to determine the ratio. Once you have an active starter, it is very resilient and very hard to kill. It will be fine no matter what ratio you use. I have another video of how to maintain your starter, and you will see more in detail about this. Scrape the jar, cover, and leave it at room temperature for 24 hours. On day 7, the starter is reliably rising above the band daily and has lots of bubbles. The jar is getting a little crusty, so I'm going to switch to a clean jar. Theoretically, this is now ready to make bread, but I would recommend giving it at least 2 more days, preferably a week if you have the time, just so that it's even more stable and active. That will increase your chances of making a successful loaf of bread on your first try. Plus, you can use those extra days to observe when your starter reaches its peak. To know when your starter is ready, you can do the float test. This brings us to tip number 6. Float test is not always reliable. How I know when my starter is ready? The float test is to drop a spoonful of starter into a cup of water. If it floats, then it's ready. If not, then it either isn't ready yet, or you have waited too long to use it, and it has started to fall and lose its gases. However, the float test is not always reliable. For example, if you make a starter with whole grain flour, like whole wheat or rye, even when they are ready, they may not float. This is because lower gluten flours, such as whole wheat or rye flour, may not build a strong gluten network that holds in those bubbles, which cause it to float, yet the starter may be very well ready to go. Or, if you stir it and disrupted the bubbles in there, even though the starter is ready, it may not float neither. Therefore, besides the float test, you should learn how to observe your starter. Knowing how many hours it takes for it to at least be doubling in size will help you determine when the best time to use it. Then you can schedule your bread making time accordingly. After you feed your starter, the mixture is going to start rising in the jar and eventually has a dome top. The dome top is a sign that your starter is still going up and is still really active and hasn't run out of food yet. Eventually, the dome is going to flatten out, and when you look inside, it looks weak and looks like it can collapse easily. That means it has run out of food. It is still at its most active state, but it's going to start falling back down and becoming less and less active. There's actually a big window of time where your starter will be in this rising state. So as soon as it's at least double in size, has a dome top, while it may still be rising, it's good to use to make bread. If the top is flat or fallen a little, it will still work, but most likely won't give you a result as good as a very active starter. For example, look at this starter here. It has passed its peak. You can see that the top is flat and even started to fall a little. If I'm to do that float test, it will still float. However, it is not good enough to make bread, especially if you're a first-time baker where you're still learning how to work with the dough and how to observe fermentation timing. If you are a very experienced baker, you can definitely work with this. But again, this video is for beginners, and my goal is to help you to be successful on your first try. I'm giving the important factors where you will understand how this works, so don't just rely on the float test. Observe the starter state as well. The starter is the most important ingredient in your bread. You want to have an active starter to make your bread successfully. Therefore, for the new sourdough baker, I highly recommend the 2 extra days. On day 8, the starter is reliably double in size in about 4 hours. As I mentioned before, at this stage, it is at least double in size and has a dome top. Here, let's take a better look into it. It is thick and bubbly. As you can see, even after I disrupted the bubbles just now to show you the inside, the bubbly activity and rising action will still resume afterwards. This brought us to tip number 7. Study your own starter. Don't just go by what other people say. If you have seen any sourdough videos, you most likely have heard people say your starter should be double in size in 4 to 6 hours and so on. Well, while that's true for their starter, it may not be the case for you. The rise and fall cycle can be quicker or slower for everybody because that depends on 1. Newer or older starter, 2. Cooler or warmer temperatures in your home where you keep your starter, and 3. Lower or higher ratio of food to starter. If you just judge your starter's activeness based on what people say how fast their starter rises, you may think that you fail, but you are not. So you have to observe your starter. Don't just go by the time frame of what other people say. I do want to quickly address something that can be very confusing for beginners, and this leads us to our last tip. What does make your own levain or leaven means? I'm not sure if you have ever heard people talk about make your levain or leaven or creating your leaven before you make bread. That was confusing to me as well when I first started. The word levain or leaven is simply referring to the part of your starter that is going into the bread dough. What that is that people take a bit of starter from the main jar and create another offshoot starter, feed it so that the total volume is enough for your recipe, and then the main starter will be maintained separately. There are a lot of reasons why people do that. Maybe because they wanted to change the hydration of the certain type of bread they are making, or so on. However, for an everyday home sourdough baker, this process is really not necessary and will be very confusing when you are a beginner. I just want to address this, so in case you see that in any given recipes, you'll know what that means. Okay, now you have a healthy and active starter, and you have 2 options. 1, you're ready to start making bread and want to prep the starter so you can make bread the next day. We know now we have total 100 grams of starter in the jar. Because we started with 20 grams of starter, then we added 40 grams of flour and 40 grams of water. Let's say the bread recipe you found asks for 100 grams of starter. Then when we feed it today, we will discard all but 25 grams in the jar, feed 50 grams of flour and 50 grams of water. That will give you a total of 125 grams, where you have 100 grams for your bread and 25 grams left to continue feeding. Now option 2, you are not quite ready to start making bread yet. Here you have 2 more options. You can keep feeding it daily and leave it at room temperature. Or you can place the starter on a brief pause. This will bring us to another video where I'll show you how do you maintain your starter with very minimum effort and discards. Hope you find this video helpful in your sourdough journey. Thanks so much for watching.